The awakening. A world he no longer knew. The hospital room was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. The steady hum of medical equipment filled the air, a familiar yet unsettling sound in this otherwise still environment. The faint scent of antiseptic lingered, a constant reminder that this place existed outside of time, a limbo where life teetered between past and present. It was a Tuesday morning when everything changed. Nurses walked in and out, adjusting IV lines, checking vitals, carrying on with their day as if nothing remarkable was about to happen. The world outside continued to spin. People moved about their lives, unaware that, in this small room, something extraordinary was about to unfold. And then, it happened. A faint twitch. At first, it was barely noticeable. Just a flicker in the man's fingers, a small movement that might have been dismissed as nothing more than a reflex. But then, a slow, struggling inhale broke the room's stillness. The heart monitor spiked for a fraction of a second before steadying again. Then the impossible. His eyes fluttered open. For 10 years, Daniel Carter had been trapped in darkness, locked in a world of dreams and memories that refused to let him go. But now, as his eyes adjusted to the harsh fluorescent lighting above him, a new reality settled in. Confusion, panic, weakness. His body felt foreign, like it wasn't his own. The muscles in his arms trembled as he tried to lift them. His throat was raw, his breath labored, and every sound around him felt too loud, too sharp, too unfamiliar. The nurse on duty gasped, nearly dropping the tablet in her hands. Her training kicked in almost immediately, and she rushed to his bedside. "Mr. Carter," she said, carefully placing a hand on his wrist, her voice gentle but urgent. "Can you hear me?" His lips parted, but no sound came out. The words he wanted to form felt just out of reach, tangled somewhere between memory and reality. "Mr. Carter, if you can hear me, blink once." A slow, heavy blink. The nurse's hand flew to her mouth in shock before she quickly pressed the emergency call button. Within moments, doctors flooded the room, voices overlapping as they checked his vitals, adjusted machines, whispered words he couldn't yet understand. Get his family on the phone. Those words echoed in his mind. Family. Where were they? Why weren't they here? And why did everything feel so wrong? The first face he saw. The medical team worked swiftly, performing tests, checking his cognitive function, and making sure his body could withstand the sudden return to consciousness. It was hours before the room quieted again, leaving only a single figure standing in the doorway. She hesitated before stepping forward, her eyes filled with something between hope and disbelief. A young woman, early 20s at most. Long dark hair, warm brown eyes, and a look that felt familiar. She took a slow, trembling breath before whispering, "Dad." The word hit him like a tidal wave. Dad? His mind scrambled for answers, grasping at memories that felt just out of reach. He had a daughter. Yes, he remembered that much. A little girl who used to crawl into his lap when she had nightmares, whose laughter had once been the soundtrack of his days. But this woman, this grown woman standing in front of him, was not the child he remembered. And that realization broke him. His chest tightened as he struggled to speak. When his voice finally emerged, it was barely a whisper. "Emily." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she rushed to his bedside, gripping his hand like she was afraid he might slip away again. "It's me, Dad. It's really me." Her voice cracked under the weight of 10 years of waiting, of hoping, of wondering if this day would ever come. Daniel's mind spun. 10 years. He had been asleep for 10 years. And while time had stood still for him, the world, his world, had moved on without him. The questions he couldn't ask. Emily's presence was a comfort, but it also left so many questions unanswered. Where was his wife, Sarah? Where was his son, Nathan? Why was Emily the only one here? He searched her face, looking for the truth she wasn't saying, but before he could summon the strength to ask, The door opened again. A doctor entered, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Carter, I know this must be overwhelming, but we need to take things slow. Your body needs time to adjust, and you'll have to go through rehabilitation to regain your strength." Daniel barely processed the words. He only had one question. "Where is my wife?" Emily's breath hitched. The doctor hesitated, and in that hesitation, Daniel's heart sank. Something was wrong. Something had changed. And whatever it was, he wasn't sure he was ready to hear it. The life he lost. A new reality. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the hospital equipment and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Daniel Carter sat in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to comprehend the weight of 10 lost years. The realization hit him in waves, sometimes subtle, like a whisper in the back of his mind, and sometimes like a tidal wave of grief crashing down on his chest. He was awake. He was alive. But was he really living? His body felt foreign, weak, like it didn't belong to him anymore. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted them, tracing the deep lines on his skin. He had aged, but his mind still felt like he was in his mid-30s. 10 years had passed. 10 years without knowing. 10 years without existing. And the worst part, the people he had once loved, the family he had fought for, had moved on without him. He wasn't sure if he could blame them. The answer he didn't want to hear. Emily sat in the chair beside him, her hands nervously wringing together. She was struggling to find the right words. Daniel could see it in the way her shoulders tensed, in the way she avoided his gaze. He already knew the answer before she even spoke. But he still asked, "Where's your mother?" The words hung in the air like a fragile piece of glass, ready to shatter at the slightest movement. Emily exhaled shakily. "Dad, Mom waited for you. For years." Daniel's stomach twisted into knots. His heart pounded in his chest, anticipating the blow that was about to come. She did everything she could to keep hope alive. She visited every single day for the first few years. She brought us here, sat by your bed, talked to you like you could hear her. Emily's voice wavered, and Daniel clenched his fists against the sheets. But after 5 years, she couldn't do it anymore. Silence. Daniel felt the air get knocked out of his lungs. Emily's eyes were filled with guilt, but she continued. "She remarried, Dad." A sharp, cold stab of reality pierced through him. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, it felt like he was drowning. Sarah, his wife, the woman he had loved with everything he had, was no longer his. She had moved on. She had built a new life. Without him. And suddenly, it wasn't just the 10 years he had lost that hurt. It was the realization that he had lost her too. "I should have woken up sooner," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "It's not your fault, Dad. You didn't choose this." But that didn't make it any easier. The son he didn't recognize. The door creaked open, and another figure stepped inside. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood in the doorway. His arms were crossed, his posture stiff. His face was familiar, but different. Daniel felt his breath hitch. Nathan. His son. The last time he had seen Nathan, he was a 12-year-old boy with a mischievous grin and a world of innocence in his eyes. But the man standing before him now, he was a stranger. Nathan was grown now, older, hardened, distant. His jaw was clenched, his expression unreadable. He wasn't the same boy who used to climb into bed with Daniel during thunderstorms or beg him to stay 5 more minutes before bedtime. Daniel searched his son's face, desperate for a sign of the child he once knew. But Nathan remained silent, cold, guarded. And then, without warning, he turned and walked out. No words, no emotions, just a silent exit. Daniel's heart broke all over again. A world that moved on without him. Daniel Carter had imagined this moment 1,000 times while he was trapped in his own mind. The moment he would wake up. The moment his family would hug him, celebrate, tell him how much they missed him. But reality was nothing like his dreams. His wife was gone. His son was a stranger. His daughter had grown up without him. And the world wasn't the same anymore. Emily helped him sit up in bed, pulling a small device out of her pocket. "Dad, you have to see this. There's so much that's changed." She tapped the screen, and a holographic projection flickered into the air. Daniel's eyes widened. "What is that?" he asked. Emily hesitated before answering. "It's a phone, Dad." "Well, kind of. Everything's digital now." Daniel's mind struggled to comprehend it. The last phone he remembered was a simple touchscreen device. Now, people were using holograms, AI assistants, self-driving cars. He felt disconnected, like an outsider in his own world. Everything had evolved, and he was left behind. The first step forward. Later that night, Daniel stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He had two choices. He could give up. He could let this reality crush him, let the pain of loss consume him. Or he could fight. He could learn, adapt, rebuild. He could find a way to be a father again, even if it meant starting over from nothing. Daniel took a deep breath, clenched his fists, and made his choice. He wasn't done yet. Tomorrow, he would begin again. And this time, he wouldn't waste a second. Learning to live again, rebuilding a lost life. The hospital room had become both a sanctuary and a prison. For the past few days, Daniel Carter had done little more than exist within these four walls, eating the bland food they brought him, enduring an endless cycle of tests, and lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had changed while he stayed the same. But now, as the sun streamed through the large windows, casting a warm glow over the stark white sheets, something shifted within him. He couldn't stay like this. He had lost 10 years of his life, but he refused to lose any more. Today, for the first time, he would stand again. The first step is always the hardest. "All right, Mr. Carter," said Dr. Lewis, his physical therapist, as she adjusted the handles of the parallel bars in the rehabilitation room. "We'll start slow. The goal today is just to get you on your feet." Daniel sat in the wheelchair, staring at the metallic bars in front of him, his hands clenching the wheels. His heart pounded against his ribs. He had imagined this moment so many times while he was unconscious, waking up, walking out of the hospital, returning home to his family. But reality wasn't that simple. His body had betrayed him. His legs were weak, thin, barely more than bone and skin. His muscles had deteriorated, his joints stiff from years of stillness. Just moving his arms had been a struggle. How was he supposed to walk again? Dr. Lewis knelt beside him, her dark brown eyes filled with warmth, but also determination. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. "I'll be right here." Emily stood nearby, her face tense with anticipation. She had been his rock, visiting every day, holding on to the belief that he could recover. But what if he couldn't? What if he fell? What if he failed? "I can't," he whispered, gripping the sides of the chair. Emily stepped forward, placing her hand on his shoulder. "Yes, you can." He hesitated. Then he made a choice. With a deep breath, Daniel gritted his teeth and pushed himself up. Pain shot through his legs, sharp, excruciating, unbearable. His knees trembled violently, his arms barely supporting his weight. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to sit back down. But he didn't. With sheer determination, he took a step. His foot barely lifted off the ground, dragging forward an inch. Sweat trickled down his forehead, his breathing ragged. Then another step. His legs buckled. His balance wavered. For a brief moment, he thought he would collapse. Dr. Lewis caught him just in time. But even though he hadn't gone far, he had done it. He had stood. He had moved. And that was everything. Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "I knew you could do it." Daniel exhaled a shaky breath, his hands gripping the bars tightly. His body hurt. But for the first time since he had woken up, he felt alive. The world had changed. And so had he. Later that afternoon, Emily wheeled him out into the hospital garden, letting him breathe in the fresh air. The world outside felt strange, like an alternate version of the one he remembered. People walked past with devices he didn't recognize, their faces illuminated by holographic projections. The cars on the street moved silently, some without drivers. The city skyline had changed, taller, sleeker, the billboards now glowing with digital advertisements. The world had evolved, and he had been left behind. Emily sat beside him on a bench, watching him carefully. "Do you want to see home?" she asked hesitantly, handing him her phone. Daniel took the small device, his fingers grazing over the glass screen. He stared at it for a moment before she tapped it once, and an image appeared. His house. Or at least, the house that used to be his. It looked different now. The front yard had been landscaped, the paint a slightly different shade. A new car sat in the driveway. And there was a man standing at the front door, holding Sarah's hand. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Sarah's new husband. He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the phone. "How long have they been together?" His voice was quiet, almost hollow. Emily hesitated. 5 years. Daniel nodded, forcing himself to process it. 5 years. That meant she had waited for him. For 5 years, she had held on, hoping he would wake up. But then, she had let go. She had moved forward. And now he had to as well. But how? A broken bond. When they returned to his room, Nathan was waiting for them. His son leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Daniel hesitated. They hadn't spoken since the first day. Nathan had avoided him, barely visiting, keeping his distance. But now, as their eyes met, Daniel saw something new in his son's face. Anger, pain, resentment. Daniel took a breath. "Nathan, why did you wake up?" Nathan's voice was sharp, raw, filled with emotions Daniel didn't understand. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" Nathan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Do you have any idea how hard it was, Dad? Watching Mom cry every day. Watching Emily take care of you like she was your mother instead of your daughter. Watching our lives fall apart." Daniel flinched. "I didn't." "You weren't there." Nathan snapped. His voice broke. "You weren't there when I needed you. You weren't there when Mom needed you. We learned to survive without you. And now you just come back, expecting everything to be the same." Silence filled the room. Nathan's breathing was heavy, his fists clenched. Daniel swallowed hard. "I don't expect anything," he said finally. "I just want a chance to be your father again." Nathan shook his head. His jaw was clenched, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "You can't be." And with that, he turned and walked away. A promise to fight. That night, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying Nathan's words over and over. His son was right. He hadn't been there. And no matter how much he wanted to, he couldn't change the past. But he could fight for the future. Nathan wasn't ready to forgive him. But one day, he would be. Daniel would prove to him that he wasn't going anywhere this time. No more lost years. No more regrets. He was here. And he was going to stay. Bridges to the past. A future worth fighting for. The days turned into weeks. Daniel Carter had spent 10 years frozen in time, but the past few weeks felt longer than all those years combined. Every moment was a battle. Learning to walk again, understanding a world that had changed beyond recognition, and facing the truth about the life he had lost. But amidst all the pain, the frustration, and the heartbreak, something inside him began to heal. And today, as he stood without assistance for the first time, gripping the edge of the hospital window for balance, he realized something. He wasn't just learning to live again. He was choosing to live. The choice he had to make. Daniel had avoided it for as long as he could. But today, as he sat in a wheelchair at the edge of the hospital garden, he knew it was time. "Are you sure about this?" Emily asked hesitantly, her hands resting on the phone in her lap. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I need to see her, Em." Emily gave a small nod, understanding what this meant for him. She tapped the screen, and within seconds, the call connected. The screen flickered to life, and then, there she was, Sarah, his wife, or at least, the woman who had once been his wife. She looked different, yet exactly the same. Her hair was shorter now, streaks of gray showing at the roots. Her face had more lines, but her eyes, they were still the same deep brown he had fallen in love with all those years ago. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. And then Sarah broke the silence. "Daniel." Her voice was barely a whisper. Daniel swallowed hard. "Hey, Sarah." She blinked, as if trying to convince herself that this was real. He gave her a soft smile. "I woke up." Her lips parted slightly, and for the briefest moment, he saw the emotion swirling behind her eyes. But then, her gaze flickered away. "I know," she said quietly. "Emily told me." Daniel nodded slowly. His chest felt tight, but he forced himself to breathe through the pain. "How are you?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Sarah hesitated. Then, with a careful smile, she said, "I'm happy, Daniel." She meant it, and even though it stung, he was happy for her too. She had waited for him. For years, she had held on to hope. But in the end, she had chosen to live, and now it was his turn to do the same. "That's good," he said, his voice steady. "That's really good." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both understanding what had to be said next. Then Sarah took a deep breath. "Daniel, I'm so sorry." He shook his head. "No, don't be. You did what you had to do." Sarah blinked rapidly, as if holding back tears. Daniel smiled, a real, genuine smile. "Thank you." "For what?" "For loving me," he said simply. "For waiting. For being the kind of person I was lucky to have in my life." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. "I wish things were different," she admitted softly. Daniel nodded. "Me too." Then he took a deep breath, finally accepting the truth. "But we can't go back, Sarah." She exhaled shakily, nodding in agreement. "No," she whispered, "we can't." For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel did what he had come here to do. He let her go. "Take care of yourself, Sarah," he said with a warm smile. She smiled back, a smile full of memories, of love, of everything they had shared. "You too, Daniel." And with that, the screen went dark. And for the first time since he had woken up, Daniel Carter felt at peace. A father's redemption. 2 days later, Daniel took his first independent steps outside the hospital. The crisp morning air filled his lungs, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt free. Emily walked beside him, supporting him when he needed it, but allowing him to move on his own. "Where to next, Dad?" she asked with a smile. Daniel thought about it for a moment. Then he turned toward the one place he hadn't dared to go yet. "Nathan's place," he said. Emily hesitated. "Are you sure?" He nodded. Nathan was still angry. He still saw Daniel as the father who left him behind, even if it wasn't by choice. But Daniel wasn't going to give up on him. Not again. The moment that changed everything. The house was modest, but well kept. As Emily helped Daniel up the front steps, he took a deep breath before knocking on the door. A moment later, the door creaked open. Nathan stood there, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Daniel did the only thing he could. He stepped forward. No walker, no wheelchair, no help. And when he spoke, his voice was steady. "I know I wasn't there when you needed me, Nathan, and I know I can't change the past. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Nathan's jaw tightened, his emotions flickering behind his guarded gaze. For a long moment, he just stared at his father. Then, slowly, he stepped aside. "Come in," he said. And just like that, Daniel Carter took the first real step toward rebuilding his family. A new beginning. Months passed. Daniel continued his recovery, growing stronger every day. Nathan slowly began to let him in again, not all at once, but in small moments. Like the time they watched an old baseball game together, or when Nathan called him for advice on fixing a leaky faucet. Emily stood by him through it all, her faith never wavering. And Sarah, she had found her happiness. And so had Daniel. Because sometimes life doesn't give you the ending you wanted. Sometimes it gives you a second chance to start again. And as Daniel sat in the park one evening, watching the sunset, he smiled. He had lost 10 years, but he had gained something even greater. A new beginning. And this time, he wasn't going to waste it. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.